Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. My name is Duncan. I'm the California Director of Americans for Safe Access. Americans for Safe Access is the nation's leading medical cannabis patients advocacy organization, and we're having tonight one of our live Google Hangouts to talk about medical cannabis in California. And there certainly is a lot to talk about. I want to start, however, by saying thank you to Talana in Washington, D.C., who is our technical support for tonight and is making all this happen. So thanks a lot for joining us. If you're having any technical problems tonight with the broadcast, you can also click on the link to go straight over to YouTube and watch the broadcast live on YouTube. Our topic tonight is what legalization means for medical cannabis, and it certainly is a timely topic. This is something that's been coming up a lot, and that's because there's a lot of momentum behind legalization for non-medical use of cannabis in the United States right now. Voters in Colorado and Washington, of course, legalized cannabis in 2012, and then voters in Washington, D.C., and in Oregon and Alaska did the same in November. And so there's really a big push right now and a lot of momentum behind the issue of legalizing medical cannabis. And the U.S. Department of Justice has so far taken a very measured response. U.S. Deputy Attorney General James Cole published a memo in 2013 saying that if states legalized medical cannabis or cannabis and they had an effective regulatory model in place and they enforced those rules, then the U.S. Department of Justice was going to make enforcement of medical cannabis laws, federal medical cannabis laws, a lower priority. And so far, the U.S. Department of Justice, by and large, is made good on their word, and they have not been cracking down on the states that legalized cannabis. And so we have this tremendous push and this momentum. And yet one of the things that's already clear from the Colorado and Washington is that not all legalization looks the same. And I just want to point out that those two states, Colorado and Washington, where we have a little bit of time to look at the track record and see what's going on, they've taken very different approaches to legalizing cannabis. Colorado's Amendment number 64 created a dual track. Cannabis and medical cannabis coexisted and moved side by side, and it left the existing medical cannabis program in place. So it didn't replace it, it just added a recreational component on top of that. Whereas in Washington, Initiative 502 sought to sort of replace medical cannabis with non-medical cannabis, and that resulted in the rolling back of some rights that patients were already enjoying in the state of Washington. For instance, regulators in Washington have sought to reduce the personal cultivation limits in that state. They want to have 3 plants instead of the 15 that were already allowed. They want to reduce the supply from a 60-day medical supply to a 1-week personal use supply. We've also seen proposals to restrict staff at medical dispensaries and non-medical dispensaries from discussing the medical benefits of cannabis, so that can't be on the table for patients. We've also seen a big push for taxation. We're going to talk a lot about this tonight. 25% taxation in Washington, and so two very different approaches. And in Colorado, we've seen that this approach of the dual track has been really successful, and in Washington, the approach of replacing medical cannabis with legal cannabis has not really worked out for patients. And so California voters seem to be behind legalization. We've got a lot of momentum. We're almost certainly going to have a voter initiative in 2016. And if the polling plays out and things move forward as we think they are, it's going to pass in 2016. But California wants legalization. We want legalization done right. And for medical cannabis patients, the legalization of cannabis in the context of medical cannabis and make sure that patients aren't really giving up any ground when it comes to legalization, that instead we're enhancing the rights of Californians and protecting more Californians and moving forward and not moving backwards. And that's what I mean when I talk about California wanting legalization and wanting it done right. Now here in California, this conversation has become more urgent. This year, there were 2 bills in the state legislature that would have regulated commercial medical cannabis activity, and both of those failed. They came at it from different perspectives, and at the end they sort of merged together into a single bill, but neither one was able to get through the legislative process and to the governor's desk. And so when that happened, advocates and lobbyists and reporters started asking me, well, is that it? Are we done with medical cannabis? Is it all up to 2016 right now? And that question got even louder when we got to Election Day this year. On Tuesday, November 5th, voters in Washington, D.C. and in Washington and Alaska legalized cannabis and pushed this issue, pushed that ball even further down the court. And so we have a situation now where 4 states in the District of Columbia have legal cannabis. 30 some odd states have medical cannabis laws of some regard or the other. And so people started asking even more, is this debate over about legalization and medical cannabis? And now we're just going to be talking about legalization. And the answer is no. The idea that legalization will solve all of the problems for medical cannabis patients, or frankly for cannabis consumers in general, is mistaken. In fact, it's perhaps even a little bit naive. You see, cannabis legalization and medical cannabis overlap at the criminal justice system. When it comes to stopping raids and arrest, confiscations, imprisonment of consumers, cannabis and medical cannabis are really in lockstep, because nobody should go to jail for a cannabis-related offense. That's just unjust and harmful to our society. And yet, when we get past the issue of the criminal justice system, these two issues do diverge, and they move on parallel paths, but not on the same path. And so it's really important, as we talk about the issue of legalization and medical cannabis, that we remember this important fact from the very beginning. Medical cannabis is not a means to an end. Medical cannabis is not a stepping stone, and medical cannabis patients are not a stepping stone to legalization. These are two related issues, but they're not the same issue. And so we're going to have to treat medical cannabis and regulate medical cannabis differently than we treat and we regulate cannabis for non-medical use. And I want to pause in this conversation first and point out that cannabis is real medicine. And that may seem like a strange thing to say in this context, but it's important to keep that at the very forefront of these conversations. Now, we've known for decades that cannabis is medicine because people that we love use it and get real relief from it. And of course, many of you know personally that it helps you, and you know it's real medicine. And of course, there's a growing body of clinical research that proves and establishes the real bona fide medical use of cannabis. And so I don't think that's a real issue to debate anymore, but I think it's a fact that we have to keep at the forefront. You may have seen, by the way, a study that was published in the peer-reviewed Journal of Drug and Alcohol Abuse about medical cannabis use in California. That study found that 5% of Californians have tried medical cannabis, which is a really large percentage in terms of treatments for healthcare. That's 5% of our population, and of that 5%, 92% report that they received relief from a serious medical condition. And by serious medical condition, they meant chronic pain, arthritis, cancer, HIV and AIDS, migraine headaches. These are not small complaints. And so 92% of the people who have used medical cannabis in California are getting relief from very serious medical conditions. And so that really debunks the argument that most of the medical cannabis patients in California are really just looking to get high, and this is an excuse. These are real patients who are getting real relief. And while many of them, by the way, may enjoy using their medicine, that doesn't mean that that use is not medical. Now, I know most of you watching this probably agree with that cannabis is medicine, and that's not a controversial statement, but I'm emphasizing this point because I'm afraid a lot of advocates and lobbyists, lawmakers, and media have started to look at cannabis and talk about cannabis like a commodity that should be regulated like a vice. And they've stopped looking at it like the miraculous medicine that it is. And it's very, very important to remember that we are not talking with medical cannabis about a commodity that is a vice. We're talking about medicine for real. It's okay to be enthusiastic about legalization. I think a lot of us are, and I think that momentum is going to be very important in the next 2 years. But we cannot lose perspective on medical cannabis. We still have work to do in California to regulate medical cannabis and to expand legal and dignified access to every region. And I want to point out for those of you who live in parts of California where access is taken for granted and is established, which is a wonderful thing. That's exactly what the voters intended when they adopted Proposition 215. But remember that there are still access deserts in this state. In southern regions, in eastern portions, in rural communities, there are places where there's no practical access to safe, legal, dignified medical cannabis. And there are also a lot of places where there is some access, but it's in jeopardy every day. And so we still have work to do here in California before we get to a legalization vote to secure access for people who are using real medicine to treat really serious conditions. And so one of the things we have to do, our unfinished business from last year, has to do with passing a bill that regulates commercial medical cannabis activity in 2015. Regulations are very, very important in medical cannabis. Our research at Americans for Safe Access and our experience experience in over 10 years of local regulations at the city and county level show us that regulations preserve safe access to medicine while also reducing crime and complaint in neighborhoods. And that is very, very important. And so regulations benefit everybody. And we've seen this across the board in California. And in fact, in Oakland, which was one of the first cities to regulate medical cannabis, City Administrator Barbara Killey told us that the areas around the regulated dispensaries in that city were amongst the safest in the community because of the increased foot traffic and the added security that the dispensaries brought. And in my personal experience in having helped open medical cannabis facilities around the state of California, I've seen one neighborhood after another improved and made safer by the addition of a medical cannabis facility. And so well-regulated, well-operated facilities are very important in California for making communities better. Statewide licensing is also very important in California because it's likely to persuade ambivalent communities to embrace medical cannabis and to open up their communities to safe access instead of banning it. Now, the California Supreme Court, for the time being, has allowed cities and counties to ban medical marijuana distribution facilities, collectives and cooperatives, dispensaries. But some cities and counties are rethinking that. We're seeing an expansion in the desert communities, primarily motivated by finances, and in some of our Southern California communities, where cities are looking again at this and thinking, well, maybe there is a place for medical cannabis, but it would be much easier if these cities and counties had a very clear directive from the state saying this is what's legal, this is how far you can go, and it's okay to license and permit medical cannabis facilities in your community. And so that's an important benefit of that bill as well. It's also really important for us that we shore up the medical cannabis program in California and bring to that program the legitimacy and the public support that comes with statewide licensing and regulation, with that consistency in those standards. That's going to be important for medical cannabis patients, but it's also going to be important moving into the legalization debate in 2016. If you're an advocate for the legalization of cannabis, the worst possible scenario for you is a perception in the public, whether it's real or not, a perception in the public that medical cannabis is out of control in California. That perception will be an anchor around the neck of a campaign in 2016 to legalize cannabis for non-medical use. And so it's very important that we get our medical house in order before we move into that debate about legalization. It's important we remember as we move forward on this that we don't regulate vices like alcohol and tobacco the same way that we regulate medicine. It's not the same approach. And while it's a common cannabis is safer than alcohol, and it's demonstrably true, that doesn't mean cannabis is regulated like alcohol or like tobacco or like any of the other vices that our state government might seek to regulate. You see, regulation of vices primarily focuses on controlling and restricting access and generating revenue. That's an enforcement-oriented regulation model. But regulation of medicine focuses on safety and efficacy, or regulating medicine then is an access-oriented model. These are two completely different approaches to regulating something, and we want to be sure in California as we move forward with our regulatory process that we don't let cannabis slip away from that real definition of medicine to become a vice-oriented commodity that's regulated the same way that alcohol and tobacco is regulated. We want medical cannabis in California that's regulated just like medicine is regulating, and that's going to be an important step for us. And I'm afraid we may be losing some ground on this front. This month, voters in California adopted 6 out of 7 ballot measures imposing a sin tax on medical cannabis, an excise tax in excess of state sales tax. And that's a really disturbing trend for me. And in fact, in Cathedral City, voters imposed a 15% sin tax on medical cannabis. So when you combine 15% with the existing sales tax in that community of 9%, that's a 24% tax on doctor-recommended medicine. And that is just not right. That's the kind of a tax that you might impose on a vice if you wanted to limit its use, if you wanted to penalize users, if you wanted to generate revenue in exchange for the what I would call the quote privilege of engaging in that vice. That's not the way we approach medicine. And I think when I see these sin taxes on medical cannabis, what that alerts me to is that voters and lawmakers who put these ballot measures on the ballot, for the large part, are not looking at cannabis as medicine. They're looking at it as advice, and that's not the right way to look at this commodity. This is medicine for real. And so we need to be aware of these sin taxes, because the sin taxes are not a good idea for medical cannabis, and they're also not really a great idea for non-medical cannabis. And we have to remember that in both of those markets, the more taxation you pile on top of this legal and regulated commodity, the more people you're going to push back out into the illicit market. And that's not the goal of legalization, and it's also not what's best for legal medical cannabis patients, who have come to expect that they would have safe and well-regulated access in many communities. And so a tax of 24% is really counterproductive to those ends. I also want to mention in California that voters were very skeptical in this election cycle of adopting new regulations for medical cannabis in cities and counties, or improving regulations that existed already. And so that's just, to my thinking, more evidence that voters in local communities are not looking right now at medical cannabis as a medicine, but are instead looking at it in terms of controlling and reining it in. And we do not want to go in to this legislative cycle in 2015 looking at medical cannabis that way. And it's not going to have the best outcome for all cannabis consumers in 2016 if that's what the playing field looks like moving forward. And so when voters get back to a place where they're seeing medical cannabis as real medicine, they're going to make better choices about how to regulate it in the state of California. So let's talk for a minute, if we can, about how the regulation of cannabis for non-medical use and medical cannabis might differ. And I know there are many of you logged on already who have questions and comments that you'd like to submit, and you can go ahead and start sending those in. I'm going to get to those questions and comments when I get to the end of my prepared comments. So go ahead and start typing those in. There's a short delay between the time you type and the time that it gets to my screen. So go ahead and start typing, and we're going to get to as many questions and comments as we have time for tonight. So in terms of the regulation of cannabis and medical cannabis, safe in both markets. Obviously, everybody wants a safe product. Everyone wants a pure product. Labeling will also probably be an issue that's important for both. But the needs of medical cannabis patients diverge from what recreational consumers want, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. Medical cannabis patients are going to have much more concern about the route of administration of their medicine. That is it smoked, ingested, vaporized, taken as an edible preparation. These considerations are not matters of preference for patients, but very often matters of need for medical cannabis patients. And so laws that step on different routes of administration and restrict those are not going to be ideal for medical cannabis patients. Regulations need to deal with efficacy for given symptoms or conditions. The FDA is standing in the way right now on a federal level of medical cannabis providers and cultivators being able to specify a certain strain for a certain condition, and yet medical cannabis patients are going to need to talk about and discuss their medicine in that context. And so that's very, very important that the regulations around medical cannabis don't do anything to prevent that peer-to-peer conversation about efficacy of medical cannabis. Dosage issues are going to be more important for medical cannabis patients. Obviously, there's an effective dose for the symptoms that each medical cannabis patient is trying to treat, and so in a recreational context, dosage may be less important. A person who's looking for an inebriation effect may not be as concerned about dosage as someone who, for instance, is looking to stimulate their appetite because they're in chemotherapy. And for the person in chemotherapy, that dose-sensitive information is much more crucial to their well-being than a non-medical cannabis user. The preparation of cannabis, how it's prepared and how it's presented and used by the patient, is going to be very important as far as its efficacy and its utility in a medical cannabis use. And something that doesn't come up much, and I think is going to be an increasing issue in the cannabis and medical cannabis debate, has to do with niche markets, small classes of patients who have a certain strain that works for them. For instance, if you are a person with epilepsy, whether you're an adult or a child, a CBD-rich strain might be the right medicine for you. However, in a free market, in a recreational market, that CBD medicine might not command a market share that makes it profitable to produce in a quantity that would be commercially useful. And so it's going to be very important in a medical model that we always preserve the right of individual patients and their caregivers, whether it's individually or collectively in a non-commercial context, to cultivate their own cannabis. And if I take any great issue, or whether I say if I take the greatest issue with what's happening in the state of Washington right now, it's that they're really stepping on the right of individual patients to grow their own medicine. It is not the right approach in a regulatory model to channel medical cannabis patients into a recreational arrangement, into a recreational system for the sake of generating revenue. It's very important that patients always have the right to grow their own medicine that works best for them. It's also, by the way, very important to preserve a certain degree of innovation and experimentation and evolution within the field of medical cannabis, because obviously commercial grows may be very good at producing a popular strain, but market forces may not always drive the development of the cannabis plant and of different cultivars in the direction that we need it to go for individual groups of patients. And so no legalization model that steps on the personal medical cultivation is going to be beneficial for patients. We must preserve that as we move forward in California. And I know for many people in industry, they think, oh, but wait a minute, if people can grow their own, why would they ever buy it? And I can tell you, having been in the industry for 17 years at this point, that the personal cultivation of medical cannabis does not impact the marketplace in a negative way. It's only a plus to the marketplace for cannabis, and I suspect it would be also for the non-medical marketplace. And so I want to really encourage voters to insist, as we're writing and talking and thinking about what's going to happen in 2016, that personal cultivation stay at the forefront of that process. So those are some of the areas where regulatory needs are going to differ in California, and we're going to have to start addressing this in 2015. It would be really great if we had a law on the books in 2015 and we can move into 2016 not worrying about those issues when it comes to medical cannabis. But I also want to talk a bit about the financial burdens that are placed on medical cannabis patients and that we need to be aware of that differ between cannabis and medical cannabis issues. Medical cannabis should not be subject to sales tax. Now, that's a battle we fought in 2005. In fact, ASA was sort of the Lone Ranger out there fighting the Board of Equalization in 2005 to stop the sales tax on medical cannabis. And I believe the Board of Equalization had the discretion to do that, but they chose not to. And so for now, we've lost that battle. I don't see a path forward in the state legislature to remove sales tax. And so we're kind of stuck with sales tax on medical cannabis right now. But medical cannabis is not covered by insurance, and it exists in the free market. Rather, I should say, it exists in the shadow of the black market. And so that marketplace makes medical cannabis very expensive. And so it's not covered by insurance, it's subject to sales tax, and now it's got this sort of black market tax and inflation that it comes with. And so we need to be really aware of that when we're regulating medical cannabis. I think that there's a fundamental difference between taxing medicine and putting sin taxes on medicine and exorbitant fees and asking consumers to pay a higher tax for the privilege of using a substance that was previously illegal. Now, I do not think excessive taxation on non-medical cannabis is a good social policy, but I think it's a fundamentally different question for voters and for consumers than tax on medicine. Taxing medicine hurts sick people, and we need to keep that taxation where it's necessary at the lowest possible level. Finally, in addition to the regulatory issues about safety and efficacy and the preparations in niche markets and the taxation, there are issues that differ with medical cannabis in terms of protecting patients from discrimination. Now, obviously, it would be best if all cannabis consumers are protected from discrimination, but there's a fundamental moral imperative in my mind to protect patients that are using medical cannabis that differs from recreational medical cannabis. And I don't want anyone to think that recreational or people use cannabis for other reasons besides medicine should be subject to discretion. They should not. But medical cannabis patients are not, in the strictest sense of the word, using medical cannabis electively. They're using doctor-recommended medicine to treat symptoms. And so right now, patients in California face pervasive discrimination in employment, in housing, in parental rights, and in equal access to health care. And when I say equal access to health care, I'm primarily referring to access to pain medications. Veterans and other chronic pain patients are denied access to pain medicines if they test positive for cannabis use. And patients who need it for medical cannabis use, even though that use is legal, there's no protection under state law for being denied your pain medicines or your organ transplants. Those of you who have been following these conversations over the last months and years know a NASA member, Norman Smith, actually died after being dropped from the National Organ Transplant List for testing positive for legal medical cannabis use. And so those issues also have to be addressed under state law, and I think really need to be addressed prior to dealing with the legalization issue. I think it's going to get very complicated if the needs of patients and the wants of cannabis consumers, of non-medical cannabis consumers, get mixed together in the debate about civil rights. And again, nobody should be subject to discrimination, but it's very, very important that medical cannabis patients whose use is not elective but therapeutic in nature should never face that discrimination. So I'm going to pause here in my prepared comments and take a couple of questions that have rolled up on the screen before they go too high and I can't see them anymore. And then we're going to come back and talk about what's on the horizon in California between now and November of 2016, because we all know what's happening in November of 2016. I want to talk about the interim that's going to be so important. So here we go with some questions. Pardon me while I read these. Question. These are really excellent talking points, many of which I haven't heard before, especially put so clearly. Have you already or will you develop and distribute some conceptual bullet points and strategic language for medical advocates to talk both legalization and advocate to the general public? And the answer is yes. And in fact, I intended to do that before tonight's broadcast, and I didn't get it done. So I have my notes from tonight, and I absolutely will be publishing that. And we're going to be having this conversation on and on for the next year or two. So that's definitely coming. Second question, I'm a patient and have been a recreational user as well. I so agree with you about keeping patient rights to grow and looking to keep dispensaries safe. Thanks for breaching the gap and realizing that although legalization is important, so is keeping 215 rights preserved. Great comment. I absolutely agree. And I want to posit this question, also clarify something. I've heard misunderstanding from people who think that Americans for Safe Access opposes legalization, and I assure you we do not. The issue of legalizing marijuana lies outside the mission of Americans for Safe Access and the scope of our expertise. This organization was founded by patients and caregivers for patients and caregivers, but we do not oppose legalization. We simply don't take a stand on that. And one of the reasons we do that is so we can focus on medical cannabis exclusively. That's really, really important because it's our core mission. The other reason we do that is because we want to be able to go through doors and make connections that may sometimes not be available to people with a broader drug policy agenda. But in no way does that mean that we oppose legalization. So let me be clear on that. We don't want anyone going to jail for cannabis, medical or otherwise. It's just not in the scope of the mission we're doing. And there are other groups that are doing that work. And as a matter of fact, we're about to talk about one of them at the end of this broadcast. So one more question, and then I'll get back to the prepared comments. It says, question, in Washington, they have not taken our rights yet. We have a big fight coming to regulate. Thank you for making that point. It is true. Patients in Washington are doing a heroic job of pushing back against this this sort of momentum to roll medical cannabis and squash it into the non-medical program, and they're doing a good job of it. We didn't get a bill passed this last year, but we're going to, and I want to say thanks so much for the folks up there with Americans for Safe Access in Washington and the other organizations and the individual patients who are pushing back. You're doing an amazing job against long odds. So that fight's not over. So don't give up in Washington, but we always need to remember that some of the regulators and even the lobbyists in Washington are pushing in the wrong direction. And so we have to remember that it's not legalization at all cost. We have to maintain that safe space for the patients. So thank you for the viewer tonight for bringing that up and for being part of that. So while we're waiting for more questions to come in, I want to talk about what's on the horizon here in California. Our state legislature is adjourned now. They'll be back in December, and they're going to start talking about bills in January. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's going to happen next in California between now and 2016? Because what happens is important. And I think the best outcome for medical cannabis patients in the state is to have a solid, well-regulated, properly enforced program for medical cannabis in the state of California. But I think we can't just look at the commercial aspect. We have to look at the patient's rights aspect too. And so when it comes to patients' rights, I am very, very diligently pursuing a bill to protect medical cannabis patients who need organ transplants. It's really a high priority for me for many reasons. One is because we did have a member who died, and in my research, I estimate that about 174 Californians every year, that's not total, I mean every year, are faced with this dilemma of I need an organ transplant, and I can't get it because I use medical cannabis lawfully. And that doesn't count the people who never come to our attention, never make it to the radar because they're intimidated or coerced into not using medical cannabis before that issue ever comes up. And so ASA is really committed to bringing this bill this year to stop this discrimination against patients because while it's a small group of patients, 174 every year, the consequences are life-threatening. People have and will again die if they can't get an organ transplant and use medical cannabis. And by the way, the science on that's really excited. We're going to talk a lot more about patients' rights legislation in December, but I want you to know that is on our radar, and we are going to lead that charge in 2015 in California to make sure that patients' rights are respected. We're also looking at other areas, and we're not as far down the path when it comes to employment, housing, parental rights, and other healthcare issues, but we're looking at it. And look soon, if you're on our mailing list, for a survey about your patients' rights, because we need your input on this to make it happen. So a very important aspect of getting the medical cannabis house in order is going to be protecting rights through legislation coming up in the next year. I'm going to pause again and take some questions because I see they're rolling in, and I don't want them to get too far up the screen. This one says, question, how do you think California will regulate medical cannabis and recreational cannabis in the future versus Colorado and Washington? That's a big question, and I really would like us to see us go more down the path of Colorado and less down the path of Washington. But the truth is we don't know. We don't know what's going to be in legislation that comes up, and we don't know what's going to be in the voter initiative yet. And so the most important thing for medical cannabis patients and advocates and people who want to protect the ground we have for cannabis patients right now will be to get it in the media and in the movement conversations and in the community conversations that medical cannabis is a priority. Protecting medical cannabis is a priority when we start talking about what those bills and voter initiatives will look like. Another question says, can you point us to the most legit legalized groups? There seem to be so many and so much conflict. There is, and in grassroots politics, they say it's like herding cats. At the end of this broadcast, I'm going to give a plug to an organization with which I'm working. I sit on a committee with the California Cannabis Patients' Rights with the Reform California, and we're going to talk more about that at the end. I don't disparage any of the groups publicly. It doesn't help. And so I want to tell you guys that if you're interested in working on medical cannabis and you want to protect patients and expand access, Americans for Safe Access is here for you. And beyond that, there are many fine groups. I will just go ahead and give a shout out to our longtime allies at California. They're doing a bang-up job on representing the cannabis consumers and grassroots in the field of non-medical cannabis. And we're gonna actually get back to that question a little bit later at the end of this broadcast. Another question popped up. It says, would federal rescheduling Class 2 be better or worse? And what this question is referring to is the Controlled Substances Act divides drugs into schedules, Schedule 1 through 5, with 1 being drugs that have no medical value and a high potential for abuse, and 5 being over-the-counter medicines. Basically, they're not controlled at all, and everything in between. So Schedule 1 contains drugs like LSD and GHB and things that are not used medically, including cannabis, unfortunately, and federal law classifies it as Schedule I drug. Schedule II, by the way, which are considered dangerous drugs that have some medical use, includes heroin, cocaine, methamphetamines, et cetera, or amphetamines rather. All the drugs that you think of as the really dangerous ones. They're in Schedule II. Your doctor can actually prescribe Schedule II drugs to you, but it's not done very often because the DEA really controls that very carefully. Schedule III are regular prescription drugs. So moving cannabis from Schedule I to a different schedule would actually open up a lot of opportunities for research, perhaps for prescriptions, for federal progress. It's an important step in the process of reforming cannabis and medical cannabis laws. It's not the final fix that we need for medical cannabis, but it's a crucial element. That's why Americans for Safe Access has been a part of a rescheduling effort for, almost over 10 years now, because we really want to see cannabis off of Schedule I. The best solution is if cannabis is descheduled. We just take it off the schedules altogether and treat it like an herbal medicine. That may not be a political reality right now in the United States or even. And so a better solution than leaving it in Schedule I is moving it to another schedule. So it's better, but it's not the end goal. And let's see, I've got one more question that rolled up here. Will there only be an arbitrary amount of collectives allowed to remain legally in certain areas? How can we fight for safe access everywhere there's a need? And that's a good question. California, unfortunately, has adopted a model and embraced a model where cities and counties are in the driver's seat on regulation. And our state legislature, even our champions in the state legislature, don't seem willing to push back on that right now. And that's a shame. The Supreme Court has acknowledged that nothing in state law prevents cities from banning medical marijuana collectives and cooperatives or from regulating them, placing restrictions on the number, for instance. And I don't see right now in the state legislature the votes or the political will to push back on that. And that's a bitter pill to swallow, because what that means is there may always, or I shouldn't say always, there may for a long time be places in California that I call access deserts. These are places where there's really no practical access, or if there is, it's underground. And so we need our state legislature to step into that battle and fight that fight. But this past year, when we made proposals and other advocacy groups and individuals proposed changes in state law that would prevent cities and counties from banning medical marijuana facilities, not even our most dogged champions in the state legislature were willing to pick up that mantle and fight that fight for us. And when I say our most dogged champions, I will say publicly, people like Assemblymember Tom Amiano, whose credentials in medical cannabis advocacy are unquestionable. He was not willing to back down the cities and counties and say you cannot ban medical cannabis collectives, because he didn't see it as a winning battle, and other liberal Democratic lawmakers weren't as well. So what we need is to make the safest possible place under state law for collectives and cooperatives, and we really need to invigorate local efforts to roll back bans through the voter initiative process. We didn't do very well in 2014 on that level, and we need to do better moving forward in 2015 and 2016. Until we do, yes, there will be restrictions that restrict how many collectives and cooperatives, and in some cases, restrictions that say no collectives and cooperatives. Next question says, this is related, was there a decision in the latest federal court case? And if you're referring to the court case challenging the ban, I think in Fresno the answer is no. I have not heard yet that there was any decision in that case. And then one last question before I move on to what's on the horizon. When you gave the name of the legalized organization, you kind of blooped you. That may be a glitch in the system. The website, I'll say it now, and I'm going to say it again when we get to the end of that. It's Reform California, reformcalifornia.com. It's a coalition of organizations, including CCPR. And I sit on one of the committees for this organization in order to represent the interests of cannabis patients in this debate. And that coalition is called reformca.com. REFORMCA.com. So get on that mailing list if that's important to you. reformcalifornia.com. Okay, so let's go back now and pick up that conversation about what's on the horizon. I talked about patients' rights and protecting that through legislation. It's a top priority. I am so excited to get back to that work in 2015. It's been off the radar for a couple of years because we just weren't getting traction in the legislature. And so let's get back and talk about commercial regulations. It's going to be controversial. And here's the thing that we have to realize about commercial regulations. We, and I say we as the medical cannabis community in general, the industry and the community, we're not the only players at the table. We've got patient advocates, industry lobbyists who represent providers and cultivators, lawyers, all of those groups. We have law enforcement, and we have cities and counties, and we have organized labor. They're all at the table. Local regulations and rather state regulations in California. So it's not a simple conversation anymore. We need to get a state licensing and a state regulation bill adopted in this state to remove barriers for 2016, but also to bring to patients those proven benefits of regulation and expand access in the access deserts right now. We need to do it. And so in order to do that, we're going to have to sit down at the table with people we don't agree with, maybe people we don't like, and we're going to have to make compromises. And the activist in me, the guy who used to lock down in front of federal buildings and get arrested at protests, says, no, don't compromise. But the pragmatic advocate in me says, no, sometimes you compromise. I don't know what bills are coming in 2015 for regulations, but I expect you're going to see a law enforcement bill and an advocates bill and an industry bill and a labor bill, and maybe they'll be combined into fewer categories. Maybe they'll all be competing, but everybody has an interest and a stake at this table, and everyone's going to come there. And so what I think is imperative for our community to do is not to dig in our heels and say it's all or nothing. That's not how legislation works. If you want something that's pure and noble and there's no compromise involved, for God's sakes, don't go to Sacramento. That's not what this city is about. It's about compromise. And if we're going to get something for patients in 2015, we're going to have to sit down at the table and negotiate with law enforcement and negotiate with cities. And patients have to give a little to industry. And industry, and let me be very clear about this, industry has to give a little back to patients. We all have to compromise in this process. Labor has to acknowledge the consumers. Everyone has to give a little in the process in order for it to work. If we can do that, if we can approximate that and move the ball down the court, we might pass a regulatory bill in 2015. And we might have a working system in 2016. And if we can't, we're going to be stuck in the same impasse that we've been in for years now in California. We simply can't pass statewide legislation. And so I really want to encourage our community to be pragmatic about this, know what your boundaries are, know what your boundaries are for I'm not going any further, but then be very pragmatic about this, because we don't have to fight every battle in 2015 when it comes to commercial regulations. I would love to see a middle-of-the-road bill that everybody gets behind: advocates, industry, law enforcement, city, and labor. If we can achieve that, we will have really, really accomplished something in California. I also want to put this out there for the consideration of the community, is that on the legislative agenda in 2015, and perhaps even in 2016, might be a bill to legalize cannabis for non-medical use. And so all of that same pragmatism may come into play in a bill that does what the voter initiative might do. Advocates could bring that bill. Advocacy organizations could bring a bill to legalize cannabis in California as opposed to a voter initiative. And state lawmakers might choose to put a bill like that on the ballot. They've done this in the past in order to I guess, for lack of a better metaphor, steal the thunder of a legalization initiative. And so be prepared for bills that might legalize cannabis or further decriminalize it or destigmatize it in some way. So that may also be on the agenda. I'm looking back here at some questions. Good, I think we're up to date. Awesome. Sorry, it's a lot to keep up with on the screen there. So that's some of the stuff that we're going to be seeing in the state legislature coming up in 2015. If we can really nail down that medical program, I think everybody, patients and non-medical users, are going to be looking at 2016 as a much, much better landscape. One of the important aspects, by the way, I'm in order. If we can persuade the public that the situation is under control, the heat goes off, the public pressure, the backlash, all of that fades away. And there really is not a crisis for medical cannabis in California right now. We're doing a pretty darn good job of getting medicine to patients, but the perception that our program is unregulated is fueling federal pressure, and it's fueling alarm in our lawmakers and resistance the issue, and I think it's keeping access out of some communities. If we can nail that down and settle that issue, I think we're going to see the access in California expand, even if we don't mandate access in cities and counties. Even if they maintain the right to ban collectors and cooperatives, we're still going to see an overall expansion in access in California by getting something on the books. And so I'm excited about that opportunity too. So if we keep working on medical cannabis for the best outcome we're going to see the best outcomes for medical cannabis patients and for non-medical cannabis patients. It's really the best outcome for everyone in the state of California. And so that is my call to the state: is let's do that. Let's don't throw up our hands and say, oh, the voters will fix it in 2016. That sense of inevitability is dangerous for patients, and it's dangerous for the movement for legalization as well. So let's keep working state campaign and on our local campaigns to reform cannabis law and to get some state licensing and some protection for patients' rights. And ACE is going to lead that charge for medical cannabis patients' rights and for sensible regulations in California in 2015. And so I'm hoping all of you will come along with that and support us in that and work in your organizations or individually and with Americans for Safe Access to get those laws adopted in 2015, and then we'll be on to 2016. We're coming up to the end of our time, and also to the end of my prepared comments. And so I want to ask if you have any questions. You've been waiting. There was a comment you wanted to make or a question. Go ahead and do that now, because we're almost out of time. I want to repeat again the name of the coalition I mentioned before, Reform California. It's reformca.com. REFORMCA.com, reformca.com. That's the place to plug in for the legalization debate. There's also, by the way, a big picture that's happening with medical cannabis on the federal level. And I am really excited, much more excited about the federal level right now than I am about what I've seen in California in 2014. Our Republican-dominated House of Representatives voted to cut off funding for medical cannabis enforcement this year, in May of this year. That's amazing. The Democrats never pulled that off. The Republican-dominated House did that. The Senate might vote on it by the end of the year. We don't know if that's going to happen yet or not, frankly. There are proposals right now for amendments in Congress to help veterans have access to medicine, to reform the tax rules that are punitive against legal medical cannabis businesses, to allow for legal medical cannabis businesses to have bank accounts. There's a ton of momentum going on in Washington, D.C. And what that tells me about medical cannabis is that we're moving into the mainstream, where we're going to be treated like herbal medicine and complementing alternative therapies. And by the way, 10% of the public uses cannabis on a regular basis. 40% of the American public uses complementary and alternative medicine. And so there's a big world out there of people who might benefit from cannabis, whether it's in the conventional sense of medicine that we mean it right now, or in some larger herbal medicine and wellness sense. And so it's an exciting frontier, and I'm really excited to see Washington, D.C. opening up to medical cannabis and the broader drug policy debate. And so I want to invite all of you while we wait to join us in Washington, D.C. I want you to come out there with us. March the 27th through the 31st of 2015, we're having our 3rd annual National Medical Cannabis Unity Conference in Washington, D.C. It's at a brand new hotel, a better one, I think, and it's going to be just a wonderful event. There were 300 people at last year's conference. We're expecting a much bigger crowd this year. They'll be from all over the country and from the world, as a matter of fact, and it's really going to be a premier event of scientists, clinicians, politicians, activists, and advocates, and patients. A mix you won't see anywhere else at this conference. We're going to talk about crucial issues about medical cannabis, about paths forward. And then on Tuesday, on March 31st, we are all going to the Capitol together. And we're going to talk face-to-face with our lawmakers, which is a crucial element of changing federal law. And so while these state campaigns are important and we have to do it, we also have to change that federal law, and you can be a part of that in March. The reason I'm mentioning that right now in November is because we have early bird discounts for the conference, and airfare is really cheap. And so if you're going to be flying into the Washington, D.C. area, go ahead and do it. I want to encourage you to go to www.nationalmedicalcannabisunityconference.org, www.nationalmedicalcannabisunityconference.org. Read about the conference, get registered, take advantage of those early bird discounts and come on out there and be a part of that. We need California voices in Washington, D.C. It's so, so crucial. So your URLs, let me reiterate, are reformca.com, National Medical Cannabis Unity Conference.org. And lastly, I have one final appeal. You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again tonight. Americans for Safe Access provides the programs and the services we do, the direct advocacy, the educational materials and the training for advocates and the conferences. All of that comes from the membership dues that people like you pay. If you're not a member, RASA, I want to call on you to join. Go to our website at safeaccessnow.org and click on that join button in the upper right-hand corner, because we need your support to do the kind of work that we're doing in cities and counties all over California, that we're doing in Sacramento for statewide regulations and patients' rights, and that we're doing in Washington, D.C. right now at this crucial moment in the national capital. So please join us and be a part of that. And I'm going to give one final call for comments. I understand there's a short delay, so I won't cut it off too soon. But while I'm waiting for any last comments or questions to pop up on the screen here, I want to say thank you very much for joining me tonight, for being patient and listening, and for your participation. You can still post after this broadcast ends on the event page. You can also post on the on the YouTube page. And if you're not a member of ACE and you join, of course, then you can be a part of our mailing list and keep the conversation going there as well. So I don't see anything else on the screen. I'm going to guess we're all good. I want to say thank you. Have a great night. Have a wonderful holiday season coming up. And we will be back here for the next live Google Hangout on December the 20th. So look at the page and at the email list and on our website for updates about that, and mark it on your calendar. December 20th, the next live Google Hangout. I hope we're going to be talking about exciting news about patients' rights. So stand by for an exciting holiday season announcement about patients' rights in California. Thanks again. Have a great night, and I will see you next time.